Good morning and welcome to the Severe Weather Mitigation and Resiliency Advisory Council first public meeting. We're in what we call a listen and learn meeting here at the Legislative Office Building. I'd like to welcome our committee or our council members and let our Insurance Commissioner, Andrew Mays, begin with an opening statement and comments for us.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you all for your time and commitment to this most meaningful mission. We've seen the history of what's happened in Connecticut lately, what's happened in California, what's happened throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. We've seen the acceleration in extreme weather events and the need to be prepared for those events. And what you bring to the table today, as I look around this table, is insight from many disciplines: insurance, construction, finance, the environment. You represent consumers, academics, nonprofits, all in service to the best interests of the people of Connecticut. You are what we need at this moment to make Connecticut, our citizens, our businesses, our communities more resilient as the effects of severe and costly weather events become ever more widespread, ever more frequent, ever more devastating. It may be a bit stale, but the adage rings true: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And when we fortify properties ahead of violent weather, we can not only make a great investment in the future that gives us a fabulous return, we reduce the financial, emotional, and social effects of natural disasters. One of your charges is to explore grant programs that can provide much needed resources for individuals and businesses. And this is particularly important for our marginalized communities, those individuals and families least equipped to deal with disaster. For them, the gaps in protection are devastating. Over the course of your work, I ask you to be diligent in examining and considering best practices around the country, such as outreach campaigns and programs that provide financial resources and technical assistance to fortify roofs, retrofit buildings to reduce recovery costs. And let's not forget to save lives. You have an awful lot of work ahead of you, and I am confident this group will proceed with thoughtful deliberation, collaboration, and the passion it takes to make a difference. I want to thank you all, and just so everybody knows, what I would like to do, if the co-chairs would allow me, is to introduce the council members. Thank you. And our advisory council members, most of whom are here today. You've got Sonia Larkin-Thorne, who is a co-chair. She is a consumer advocate, and that is one aspect of Sonia. She has a long history both on the industry and a demonstrated concern for consumers that will serve us well. Robert Hodeling is a Deputy Program Advisor for Infrastructure, which is important to the state of Connecticut. You know, part of what we're doing is we have to look at our infrastructure. We have to look at how we harden that infrastructure in order to address the effects of climate change. To my immediate right, the person at the insurance department who has long been an evangelist for addressing the impact of climate change, who I've been fortunate enough to have represent me at a number of forums, including the UNDP Sustainable Insurance Forum, the Assistant Deputy Commissioner for Property and Casualty, George Bradner. We have from the American Red Cross, Connecticut and Rhode Island. And I'll tell you, we've had a number of conversations with the Red Cross because we're used to seeing the Red Cross come in when disasters happen, but that is not their sole mission. The Red Cross would like to prevent those disasters from happening. And I'm happy to have Richard Brannigan, who is the CEO of the American Red Cross of Connecticut and Rhode Island, here with us. The Green Bank. For many people may not know, Connecticut is a national leader in a public-private partnership to provide resources to mitigate climate change, and that's led by Brian Garcia, who is the president of the Connecticut Green, president and CEO. I'm forgetting one of your titles there, Brian, of the Connecticut Green Bank. Or partners in the insurance industry. Because one of the things that I always say as we address climate risk is that nobody does it alone. There has to be a holistic solution. It's industry, it's regulators, it's consumers. Everybody has to work together because this is way too broad a topic for us to tackle individually, and it is way too important an issue for us to ignore. And from industry, from the Hartford, one of our leading insurance companies, we have the VP and the opposite Chief Underwriting Officer, Joe McDew. And Joe, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name properly there. Okay, thanks. I appreciate the forbearance. Thank you, sir. Unable to be with us today, it is the holidays after all, and people do tend to travel to be with their families, is Eric Nelson, who is a Senior VP of Enterprise Catastrophe Risk Management at the Travelers Company. From UConn, we have James O'Donnell, who is a professor of marine sciences and executive director of CIRCA, the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. The Home Builders and Remodelers Association of Connecticut, and I don't think we need to tell you how important it is to have them at the table. Their CEO, Jim Powers, is with us. From OPM, the Office of Policy and Management in the state of Connecticut, we have the Climate and Infrastructure Policy Development Coordinator, and an incredibly busy woman, I know, because I get 15 emails from her on this topic every day, Joanna Wozniak-Brown. And joining us virtually from Swiss Re as the head of the Government Affairs for Americas and Senior VP of Swiss Re, Matthew Wolf. Now, thank you all for being here, as I mentioned. Thank you all for your willingness to serve. We are in your debt. And with that, I will stop talking and I will turn it over to the co-chairs, Robert and Sonia.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for those wonderful words and introductions to our council. So we have a slate of incredible speakers, and we really want to give as much time to them since they have a lot of incredible information to share. So first, we'd like to introduce, actually, before I do that too, I want to thank the Commissioner for giving us the opportunity, as well as the council and my co-chair, Sonia Larkin-Thorne. It's been a real honor and pleasure to serve on this, and we hope to make an impact as best we can. If you would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Rob, but also thank you, Commissioner Mays, for bringing us all together, for your incredible insight into what needs to be done to improve the situation in Connecticut for Connecticut consumers, your commitment to the state of Connecticut and to our consumers, and the work that you've done here and the work you've done at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners has just been incredible. And we appreciate everything you've done. But more importantly, we appreciate you and also the incredible individuals that sit around with us today. I want everybody to recognize that the folks around this table today also have everyday jobs. They work and then they come and do the work that we're doing today for the residents of Connecticut. So thank you all on behalf of Rob and myself and the Connecticut Department of Insurance. I truly appreciate you all and the time that you put in and will continue to put in for the rest of this year and next year in helping us resolve this issue for our residents. Again, thank you. I just want to say something that I happened to be reading the other night that really kind of brought all of this home. The Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes wrote, there are years when nothing happens, and years in which centuries happen. These days, everything seems to be happening at the same time. And that's what we're faced with as we try and address the issues of weather and mitigation and resiliency. Everything seems to be happening at once. So thank you all for being able to come to this table and work with us to solve everything that's happening when it comes to weather events in the state of Connecticut. Rob?
Thank you for that, Sonia. So we'd like to transition to our first speaker who's joining us remotely. Jeffrey, and I'm hoping, again, apologies on the last name, Sajowski. We would love for you to now give a quick presentation on the economic impact of severe weather events. Thank you.
Yep. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Okay, and I'm trying to share my screen here. Are you seeing that? Do you see a slideshow? Yes?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Thank you. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here today, and congratulations on getting this council set up and moving forward on all this. What I'm going to try to do in the next 15 minutes or so is just sort of provide a broad overview of the economic impacts of severe weather events, and really, in a way, I think set the table for some of the other talks that are going to follow. I'm the research director at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, and just a brief disclaimer here, this is not representative of anything from the NEIC. This is just my own thoughts around this topic. So I'll just start with maybe a headline that recently was put out there from one of our council members that works for Swiss Re. This was a report that they put out just a couple of weeks ago on what sort of global losses for severe weather events, catastrophic risk, look like in 2024. And I'll just highlight a few things from this. I mean, you can see this notion of economic losses versus insured losses. And globally, in 2024, economic losses are 320 billion, with insured losses about 45% of that. The other thing I would highlight here is just off to the right, this previous 10-year average. You can see how, as some of the comments that Commissioner Mays was just opening with, how this has increased over time for both economic losses and insured losses. And of course, the difference between those two things is what is referred to as a protection gap. And these again are sort of global losses, but you can see for the US, a significant proportion of that are estimated out of that total $135 billion number. So what I want to do is to kind of build from that, some of those themes in there, is sort of look at, well, can we think about economic impact from a US and even briefly from a Connecticut context? And then take a step back and sort of think about, well, what's really driving? How do we think about the notion of these impacts, and what's behind them? Come back to why the role of insurance is really critical, not only in terms of the protection gap, but also as a lever for risk reduction. And then finally end with just what is not included in those numbers, that again, I think some of our other speakers are going to, pick up on. Some of you might be familiar with this, but the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, puts out these billion-dollar disasters. They track them throughout the course of the year. This is what it looks like for 2024. 24 separate billion-dollar weather events, and you can see kind of across a number of different hurricanes, wildfires, severe convective storm, et cetera. And it's impacting, a pretty wide swath of the country. So these numbers, what do they include? Okay, so the estimate for 2024, which is slightly below where they've kind of been over time recently, and I'll come to that in a second, or in a minute, excuse me, is 61.6 billion in 2024. Some of these estimates, I think, are still waiting on some numbers from some of the recent hurricanes. But these costs, what they're measuring is, if you refer back to that first slide that I showed you, are kind of the total economic costs. And they're picking up really what I would just kind of lump as kind of physical damage, whether this be to residential, commercial, municipal, some damage to public assets, right, infrastructure, et cetera, business interruption. So this is really, if you think about this, kind of direct property losses. And this is really the way that the insurance industry thinks about and views these losses, right? So total economic loss is 61.6 billion, and some fraction of that is going to be covered through insurance. It's just important to kind of keep that in mind, and we'll come back to that at the end. So that's 2024. And then kind of to, some of the, again, highlighting some of the things that Commissioner Mays had talked about. Well, they track this data back to the, 1980s. And you can sort of see, this is for the entire US, you can see how these things have changed over time. And I'll just highlight, you can look at that third column in the number of events per year. Remember in 2024, they're up to 24 of these events, but you can see in the 1980s, it was 3.3. Last year it was 28. In the last 3 years, it's an average of 22. The last 5 years, an average of 20.4. The big thing is that these numbers overall across the country have been increasing. The total cost of these, as you look over this 44-year period, is nearly $3 trillion, and this is adjusted for inflation. That's a pretty significant number. And then you can look too at just how these have changed over time in terms of the cost per year. And again, you see these increases over time from 21.9 billion up to, in the last 3 years, nearly 150 billion in total economic costs for these events. And the last thing I would mention, I'm kind of focused more here on property aspects, but of course there's a fatality or injury components of these as well. And that should not be discounted at all. But typically in sort of the US, what you've seen is some drop in the fatalities, but these significant increases in property destruction. If you go to the NOAA website, you're able to look at this from a Connecticut perspective too. And while the numbers here might not be as drastic as what you just saw for the US, remember again, these are just the billion-dollar events. You still see similar types of trending in terms of the events per year, going from the 1980s to 0.7, less than one per year, to now last year 2, but in the last 3 years on average, 2 of these billion-dollar events per year. And for a state like Connecticut, right? I mean, a billion-dollar event is or greater is a big deal. And you can kind of see some of the costs that are associated with that. Of course, probably a number of you went through and dealt with some of the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, and you could kind of see that in that number in the 2010s, where the cost number is the greatest. So Connecticut's no stranger to these events. And if you wanted to think about beyond billion-dollar disasters, right, you can think about FEMA declared disasters, and there are a number of different disaster declarations. But if this data here, you can see for Connecticut is 43 disaster declarations in total since they were tracking this in the 1940s. Mostly hurricanes and severe storms, followed by snowstorms. If you get into this map, there's detail on the counties that are impacted, which is the whole state and what that has meant. And again, if you look at that bottom panel on the left, really just sort of this increases in disasters by year. You can see that, that trend, happening. So that kind of gives you a brief snapshot of these economic impacts and, what they are just in terms of their scope and how they've been changing over time across the country and even in Connecticut. And I just wanted to now kind of take a step back and how do you think about these impacts? Like, where are they generated from? And so we'll use this framework initially of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Right. So these three pieces, the hazard itself, whether that's the hurricane or the wildfire, snowstorm, whatever it is, the property that's in its place, the exposure, and then importantly, sort of how susceptible to damage is that property actually. These three things combined form what we'll call the risk piece, but really is sort of translating into loss. So from a hazard perspective, okay, this is some data that we've worked on just in terms of wildfires, which maybe until recently hasn't been a predominant thing that you've been thinking about in Connecticut, but in the past month or so, you had a pretty severe wildfire event that transpired there. you think about hazard when what's changing here from the number of fires, and a lot of this in the western states, you see that really the number of fires hasn't actually changed a whole lot over time, right? And in some ways is even starting to slightly trend down. But that's not the only way to think about, the hazard itself. It's not just the number of events that are happening, it's how bad they are when they do occur, otherwise known as severity. And so what you're seeing in terms of wildfire is that maybe while the frequency is sort of stabilized, the severity of each of these events has increased over time. This is just represented here by the total acres burned. So for every fire that's happening, more and more acres are being burned. And some of this, as it trends into the future, and maybe some of our speakers will talk about this later on, what is the climate change impact on these ideas of frequency and severity? There are a number of tools that exist that map out this risk from just a pure hazard perspective. This is a FEMA wildfire risk map, and again, the western states. And what I just want to concentrate on here is like these different delineations of the risk from very high to low. In this particular area here, in terms of Boise, Idaho. And what you see in Boise, Idaho, is we kind of transition from the hazard piece to how that hazard, right, if it's a more severe event, how it's interacting with the exposure that sits there. And what you see from 1990 to 2020 in that area that was just highlighted on the map in Boise is that they've had significant growth, right? So part of the reason that these disasters the impacts from them are getting larger is because there's more exposure in the way, right? There's more exposure in the place in place where these events are transpiring. You can just sort of look in terms of the medium and high housing density and how that's grown within Boise. So this is sort of referred to as this expanding bullseye effect, right? So if you just have this sliver of the event, right? And that's maybe if that's not even changing, but the bullseye itself around that is growing over time, as you see in terms of exposures, you're just opening yourself up to more and more risk. And, a lot of outside of the wildfire areas, and I'm sure this is happening in Connecticut, again, there's, a lot of growth in terms of coastal areas across the country. So this expanding bullseye effect in terms of exposure. So that's the hazard, the exposure, and the last piece of that risk triangle is vulnerability, which is really the critical piece here. So this figure might be a little complicated, but I think as you hear from IBHS later on, right, essentially what you see in terms of those graphs in terms of wood, masonry, and concrete, if you think about this in terms of wildfire, as you move from a wood frame home to a concrete home, just in terms of what can burn, right, and how bad that can be, the more concrete you have in that particular situation, the better off it will be in terms of the damage for anything that's transpiring from a wildfire. If you have a wood frame home, right, it's going to burn more easily. The main point here is that there are things that can be done to structures to make them more resistant to damage, right? So even if you have these exposures in the way, what's really critical is how do you change the vulnerability of these exposures to be able to withstand some of the damage that's caused by these, increasing events. And this is not just for the individual home, but the way to think about this, I think, for the council is what could be done at a property level, what can be done at a community level, and then even from your partners at the state and national level, like how can you combine the resources and the different preparation and activities that you can do to make your communities more disaster resilient, right? So it's a combination of all these things together. It's not just, hey, this individual home doing this one particular, thing. So the third piece that I talked about is, well, okay, well, where does insurance play a role here? In insurance, if you think back to this, what we highlighted earlier, this protection gap, number one, insurance if something bad does happen, right, it improves the speed and quality of disaster recovery. Here's a study there's a link to this that references like the reduction in time given a percentage point increase in insurance penetration. And this is where kind of closing that gap on insurance is really important. 60% of protection gaps globally. I don't know the numbers offhand within Connecticut, but what I would say from a US perspective is one thing to keep in mind is that disaster insurance in the US is slightly complex because there are a number of things that are not covered by a traditional homeowner's policy, whether that be flood, earthquake, etc. And this has been shown to have confusion by policyholders. So I think it's just important to think about, well, if insurance is in place, do they have the right amount, the right type of insurance, right? If you're a coastal property, do you have flood insurance in place? And do you have the right amount of insurance? But that being said, even if you have insurance in place, that's not going to make you fully resilient. All that's doing is sort of transferring risk. And the goal is to really sort of reduce risk. So you want to have insurance in place, but you also want to have risk reduction. And insurance is also important here because it's able to provide an incentive before an event, right? In terms of if you do these things, your availability of insurance should be greater, as well as your affordability of insurance should be greater. So there's a built-in incentive to do risk reduction activities to lower your insurance premium or to have more insurance options available to you. And another thing that I would highlight is just this idea too, that there are endorsements that can be written to a policy that allow for if something does happen, that after the event, the insurance will kick in to build back better, right? So you're going to go, you buy this endorsement up front for, let's just say, $50 on a $1,000 policy. And then if something does happen, that $50 kicks in so that you're going to build beyond to code or beyond code. And that's through an insurance policy. And the data on mitigation and risk reduction activities is pretty clear in terms of mitigation saves. This is just an example of $13 per $1 invested. If it's 4 to 1, 5 to 1, 6 to 1, basically for every dollar invested, you're getting more back than what you're putting in. And I'm highlighting here just kind of these building retrofits. There's, of course, mitigation saves for building codes, which I think, Leslie will probably mention at the end, but the retrofit piece and the code piece. And again, the evidence on this is pretty clear that mitigation works to reduce these impacts. And the last thing I have is, remember I said at the outset, these costs include a lot of these physical pieces. And what they don't include are things like damage to the environment, mental or physical impacts. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I think our next speaker is going to touch upon this, right? Beyond the property damage, there are other significant damages to communities that might not manifest itself initially, but certainly do over time. And these things need to be taken into account as you're thinking about putting in risk reduction activities and what the benefits are associated with that. This is a fairly complex way of, expanding our risk triangle, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, but then it gets to like these indirect impacts, like how well does a community cope with things? How well do they recover? What does resilience look like, again, beyond insurance, beyond risk reduction? You can think about that in terms of financial resilience or human capital, et cetera. So that's all I had. Hopefully, again, that kind of sets the stage for some of the other speakers, and I'll turn it back to the co-chairs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey, for such an insightful presentation. A couple of things that I just find very intriguing. One, in terms about the economic impacts to Connecticut. I think it was something like slide 7 or 8, which mentioned the number of events increasing each year and the amount, the cost, the impact economically increasing each year. So it does tend to push everyone to more strongly consider mitigation resiliency efforts. The other one that really jumped out to me before we transition is the critical role of property insurance in mitigation. You had that one slide that showed, flood, wind, earthquake, and the $13 to 1 invested. I mean, that's an incredible ratio. That should, for everyone listening to these presentations, that's one thing to keep in mind, which is the more we do now to prevent ahead of a storm, a severe storm or impact to our homes and businesses, the better the outcomes will be. So those are just really important. So, and the last one, socioeconomic impacts. And I think that's a great transition to our next speaker, Richard Brannigan of the American Red Cross. So Richard, if you wouldn't mind, we'll transition you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Go. Okay, so Jeff had some amazing information, and when we talked about the order of appearance, it was really important to have the foundation laid literally and figuratively of what the impact of climate change that we're seeing in our respective worlds and what we can bring to that to the discussion of the council here and the charge from the commissioner to try and make some sense of the landscape now and what can be done going forward. And our work here today lays the groundwork for that and some of the foundations. And, some of the numbers that just jumped off the page at me, the $24 billion weather events that we had in the last year alone, we see that on the Red Cross side in our response. And you'll see a little bit later that our response is now relentless. It's repetitive loss. Okay, sorry. So our losses are repetitive losses, and as you'll see later, it is a recurring event. It is a cycle of disaster that we've never seen before, and that we are struggling at times to respond to. The other numbers that jumped off the page at me in Jeff's presentation: 474 fatalities, 3 of which were in the state of Connecticut for Western Connecticut flooding that we responded to. So there is a personal toll, and I will spend some time speaking about the human impact of climate on vulnerable populations, especially. And I think from my perspective, I have a unique opportunity here because I served in municipal government. I was a public works director. So if you talk about 100-year storm events, I've stood on the storm grates where they were on the borderline, on the topo maps of those, in fact, locations. And I've been a town manager, so I see how it all fits together. And for the last 12 years, I've been with the American Red Cross, a totally different perspective from a humanitarian point of view. So I see the human toll and the impact it has on people, and as we respond. And in our organization, we're the largest disaster responder in the country. We are chartered by Congress to respond to disaster. And we've been doing that since 1900, right after the Galveston hurricane. And, we are part of a worldwide organization. We're the largest humanitarian organization in the world. So our fundamental principles dictate what we do and to whom, and it's to everyone. Our services are always available to everyone free of cost. So I think we have a unique perspective here. And I wanted to spend some time talking about the vulnerability of populations. And there is a definition in terms of infrastructure, but there's also a definition in terms of society impacts, community organizations, and individuals within those communities. When we look at our disaster preparedness cycle, it comes in the same phases that FEMA would have it. And mitigation in the FEMA world is part of that resilience cycle. Ours are preparedness, response, and recovery. We take people to a recovery stage. We don't focus on mitigation because that's handled by others, including folks here in this room, fortunately. And organizations like FEMA and other nonprofit organizations that we partner with. But when we look at our impacts of disaster, it always seems, and this is in my most recent deployment, I was in Tampa, and you'll hear me speak about that a little bit for Hurricane Milton. And the people who end up in our shelters are always the folks who can least afford the impact of a disaster. So if we keep that in mind, when we talk about social vulnerability, you can categorize it in any number of ways, but it's always those people. They don't have one factor of socioeconomic status, it's multiple. So they will be handicapped and low income, and they will have health issues and a number of things. So it's multi-dimensional impacts. It's not just one. If it were one, it would be certainly much more solvable, right? So when we look at information about folks with lower socioeconomic status, we look to Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for guidance, and we see that those people with multi-dimensional impacts are affected in the greatest way. And it's simple things that studies have found that they don't follow evacuation orders as readily as some other folks, that they have not invested at all in preparedness. And we talk about disposable income to respond to disasters. And, you know, we have a kind of a rule of thumb where you keep $400 in cash. And when we talk to people about preparedness, there are many people in our own communities that do not have the ability to do that. And they're making ends meet day to day. When we look at our disaster cycle, this process that we have of preparedness, response, and recovery repeat, it used to be that there would be an opportunity for us in the Red Cross to take a breath in between those cycles, that we could focus on preparedness, and then we'd wait for a response, and then we'd look towards long-term recovery. It is a relentless cycle these days, and we're seeing it nonstop, and we are responding to multiple disasters. At the same time, we are responding this year to Helene and Milton on the eastern side of the United States. We're responding to wildfires on the western side of the United States, and right here in Connecticut, and flooding right here in Connecticut. So this is a relentless approach to it. Wanted to talk about the three areas of focus that we have in the Red Cross to categorize how we respond and prepare for disasters. And we put them into buckets: health, housing, and hunger. And as I said, there are multidimensional impacts of all of these. And I wanted to share with you a story of this woman who I met in South Carolina responding to Hurricane Matthew a few years ago. And when we talk about multidimensional, this was a woman with great personal resilience and willpower and so forth. The roof of her house consisted of a tarp that she received from FEMA. It was one of the Blue Roof program that FEMA runs. But she was sitting on top of a hilltop and had significant wind damage to her mobile home. I went in there, and there were a lot of issues. But as you can tell, she's sitting in a wheelchair. And she was a single amputee waiting on her second amputation. She was a diabetic. And to listen to her speak about her own personal resilience left an impression with me that I'll never forget. I can't tell you what her name is because I'm not going to share that information, but it's a number of issues all piling on at the same time. So when we look at our health, housing, and hunger, food insecurity, potential for homelessness for people, the impact. When we talk about infrastructure, we need to consider the human toll as well. If we're looking at the impacts we've had recently in Florida, for example, and that was my most recent experience, we look at an area of Florida that had in 22 months 4 separate hurricane events of significant categories: Ida, Idalia, Helene, and Milton. So you have people in shelters that were in evacuation shelters for Ida, went to an emergency shelter after Ida, back to an evacuation shelter for Idalia, back to an emergency shelter, and so forth and so on, and are still today in shelters in the Tampa, Florida area because they have no place to go and there's no housing stock to replace what they have. So those folks are basically homeless as a result of multiple disasters that came. So when we look at health-related impacts and deaths, Jeff's numbers are 474, 3 here in Connecticut. People who are the most vulnerable that do not have free access to oxygen, for example. Imagine you're going to be without power for 2 weeks, and this has happened here in Connecticut for Hurricane Sandy, and we dealt with the impacts of that. But you're reliant on oxygen to provide your daily health regimen and to maintain the quality of life that you have, and yet power is out and you cannot afford a generator, and you cannot afford any of the recharge facilities. And to make matters worse, your Medicaid, Medicare, whatever your public assistance might be, is going to be slow on the uptake because they're out of power as well. So it's a compounding effect. And what we see are the impacts. Again, the people who can afford it the least are affected the most. So when we look at housing stock, we look at mobile homes that are impacted, we look at apartments that are impacted, we look at housing stock that is allowed to be built in locations that are that have lower standards, or that are built in flood-prone areas that are grandfathered in with certain local regulations and with the community's acceptance that those are okay, and there's no money to relocate those folks. The last thing I'll talk about is food insecurity. And people in Connecticut, where we have on average 1 out of 8 people in Connecticut are food insecure. Children, 1 out of 6. Blacks and Hispanics, 1 out of 4 each. So when we look at an event that causes power outages, where you're losing all of the food in your refrigerator, there is no replacement. There's no $400 hidden in your mattress or behind a bookcase that will allow you to go out and purchase food to replace what you just lost. And the support that comes in is often too late. The FEMA support, even other nonprofits that have to step in. It is a reliance on community groups, and we'll talk a little bit later about the faith-based organizations that really can come in and help. When we look at the human side of disasters, it's local as well. So we experienced in late summer a 1,000-year storm event. And putting my old public works, I'm a reformed public works director, by the way, putting my hat back on, and you try to explain to people that their systems were designed around a 100-year storm event. And when we think about subdivision regulations in a municipality, and detention basins and retention basins, and the size of pipes and the impact that it has on culverts downstream, and it's based on 100-year storm events, has been my experience. And it's based on topographic maps that in some cases were flown in the 1980s. So we're looking at information, and I am so thrilled to be part of a panel that has the expertise that exists here, because you're looking down the road and you're looking at solutions that will have to include changes in infrastructure, changes in resilience planning, changes in affordable measures that fortify local homes, including multifamily homes. But when we talk about human impacts, I think about a story I heard from one of our shelter workers, where a couple was heading in Southbury. They had an evacuation shelter back in August, and the couple came in, and it was a husband and wife, and she was absolutely distraught because their home had been devastated. They did not expect it. The forecast for some of the folks in that Western Connecticut region was scattered showers. And this is an area of the state, of our state, that has had 2 tornadoes in the last 6 years, plus a 1,000-year storm event. And when they came into the shelter, the evacuation shelter that night, the woman was completely distraught. And her husband was consoling her, saying, "Don't worry, we have insurance." They didn't have insurance to cover the catastrophic loss that they experienced. And many people do not have the insurance that covers what they need in terms of disaster response. When we respond here in Connecticut to home fires, for example, we're dealing with folks on average that do not have renter's insurance. As affordable, quote unquote, as renter's insurance is, $150 to $500 a year here in Connecticut on average, again, many people cannot afford that. So their support may come from their landlord, if in fact their landlord has insurance to cover that, or they're receiving support from non-governmental organizations or cities or towns that are stepping up and offering assistance. But there's no sense of coverage that these folks have, or no assurance that they have. When we talk about impacts on mental health and vulnerable populations, we're talking, I'm sorry, let me go back. We're talking about impacts on as a result of a number of different things. I've touched on income, talked on age, disability status, citizenship status. In many cases, disaster response is race-driven. And I say that from my experience, not here in Connecticut, because I don't think we have that issue here in Connecticut, and I hope and pray that we don't. But in certain places that I responded to, in South Carolina, for example, in a rural county, there was a complete community of Black citizens who had been ignored and abandoned in disaster response. So when we look at the impact of climate, we're looking at marginalized populations, we're looking at folks who are not represented at a table. And I would encourage the folks at this table, with the expertise that you have, and I'm happy to participate in any way we can, but to think about those people, the human cost that we have and the human impact that is out there from a relentless cycle of disasters, that if we believe, and I certainly believe Jim is going to present to you the outlook for what's happening down the road here in Connecticut. If Connecticut looks anything like Florida, the mid-Atlantic states looks today, in the future, 20, 30 years down the future, we have to plan for that. We also have to include those people who are going to be marginalized that will not be at this table and need a voice in that. And whether that's local, state, federal, they all need to be heard. So, Mr. Chairman, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that presentation and the social mental health impacts from severe weather events. We're going to transition now to Professor James O'Donnell, who's going to talk about climate change and resiliency in Connecticut. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just trying to figure out the sharing mechanism here. Okay. Looks like I figured it out. Well, first, I'd like to thank the commissioner and the co-chairs for inviting me to participate in this important committee. I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about what we've learned in the last 10 years about adaptation, resilience, and climate change in Connecticut. And I want to acknowledge that I was helped immensely in this preparation by Mark DeVos, a postdoctoral fellow at UConn. So it's gonna be warmer. and there's going to be more hot nights. Sea level's going up, and there'll be more frequent flooding. There's likely to be more high-intensity hurricanes in Connecticut. These are low risk around here, but they're have a high impact. And they'll bring with them more high precipitation events. And the magnitude is uncertain. And I'm going to show you evidence for all those things in a moment. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we've been doing to try and address the consequences of those changes to our climate. I'm going to begin here with some data. The thing on the left there is the mean annual temperature. The red line is the mean annual temperature in the vicinity of New Haven, Connecticut since 1760. And back then it was about, the mean annual temperature was about 9.5 centigrade. Now it's about 11.5 centigrade. This analysis, that was in 2020. And that analysis comes from the Berkeley Earth Project. And it's a synthesis, a very careful analysis of all the temperature measurements that have ever been recorded in national archives, or are available in national archives now in Connecticut. And then there's sorting and data checking. And this is highest quality data I think there is. The thing on the left is the mean annual water level in Long Island Sound. And there are 4 curves, and they're from New London, New Haven. Oh, sorry. I jumped forward there. Okay. And New York, that's actually the western end of Long Island Sound. And they start in about 1915. That's the longest one. It's the Battery, New York. And then New London, I think the red one there. And they all are almost overlying each other. And they're going up. The gray stripe is what's called the National Tidal Datum Epoch. That's the time that NOAA uses to define what the mean sea level is. And so it starts in 1983. That's roughly the first time I came to Connecticut. And then it was just slightly below what the mean, right? A little negative. And now it's about 0.2 meters, 20 centimeters above that. So in 100 years, we've gone up roughly 40 centimeters. So that's about, maybe this much, a couple of feet, a little bit more. It does seem like a lot. And 2 degrees temperature change doesn't seem like very much either in some ways. The temperature range in Connecticut during a year could be 30 degrees. And so 2 is not that big. But what I want to demonstrate now is how significant that is in changing things that are important to people. And the first graph on the left there is number of days, or actually number of nights in which the low temperature at Bradley Airport exceeds 90 Fahrenheit. And there's empirical evidence from health data suggesting that when you get the low temperature at night is above 90, people don't like it. And they visit hospitals, and especially people who are vulnerable because of lung or heart disease or elderly. And so currently, there's roughly 12 days on average over the last 40 years when the nighttime low is above 90 degrees in Hartford. But if you took the data and assumed that led to that number and just added 1 centigrade or 1.8 Fahrenheit to that, and counted the number of days that were above 90, had it been 1 centigrade warmer, it goes from about 12 to about 20. And then if you added 2 centigrade, then it would go from like 12 to more like 40. So a small change in the mean temperature multiplies the impact of that by factors of 4. Right, the risk goes up a lot. Now, on the right side, this is a complicated graph. And I'm going to jump to, I should have showed you this. Oh, sorry. So this is the high water level at New London observed over the last 100 years or so. And the point on the right side there, the highest one, which is about 2.something meters, 2.2 meters or so, is the high water level that occurred during Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And it was that sort of drove me to make this graphic. And that is plotted at a time that's about 95 years or something like that. So if you took the view that you wanted to estimate the risk of that occurring again next year, one could argue that the best way to do it would be recognize that we've watched water level there for 100 years, 95 years, and it's been reached or exceeded once in 100 years. So the estimate of the risk is like 1 in 100, right? It's once in 100 years. The next value to its left, which is a little lower, that's another hurricane. And that value has been reached or exceeded twice in 100 years. So the risk is like 1 in 50. So it's plotted here on the log scale at 1 in 50, right? 50. And you march down the heights in descending order, and then divide that by the record length, which in this case is roughly 100 years. And you get this straight line. It's called the return interval diagram. And then what FEMA do when they're estimating the flood risk is do something like this, and they draw a line through it and project it out to 100, and they tell you what the 100-year return level value is. Right? And it looks pretty good. And there's some deviations from a straight line on the right half of the graph where there's tropical storms that are driving those. And then on the left half, the data lie really pretty robustly on the line. And those are storms that arise from extratropical cyclones, not normal winter storms. Okay, so I'm going to show you now what would happen if mean sea level over the last 100 years had been 25 centimeters higher. And I'm going to start by just showing that currently the return interval of 10 years is about 1.4 meters at New London. So the risk of that value being reached or exceeded is 1 in 10 currently. Now, if I added 25 centimeters to all the data, then instead of lying along this lower blue line here, the points would also lie along this blue line here. And the 1.4 level then would be reached at about 2 years, right? That's the way to read this. So instead of the 1.4 value being at 1 in 10, the 1.4 value would be go along this line, come to here, and it would go down to be roughly 1 in 2. Right. So again, it's a 5-fold increase in the flooding risk if you're at that level. And because these lines are almost straight, that's true like all levels of return. So things that used to be 1 in 20 will be 1 in 4, right? So it's critical, and that's with 25 centimeters. So that's roughly half of what was observed in the last 100 years. So so it's critical to know how much we should expect to see sea level rise in the future. And I published this 5 or 6 years ago. It's the basis of a report to the legislature. And it shows different ways of estimating the upper bound of what sea level rise is likely. And what we argued then is that it makes sense to expect up to 50 centimeters of sea level rise by 2050, right? And if that happened, right, then the increase in flooding frequency, our risk would increase dramatically too. So now I'm going to show you what we think is going to happen in the future, and this is based on an analysis of what's called the coupled model intercomparison project phase 6, right, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, right? So there's a lot of alphabet soup in this business. And CMIP 6 is what this project is called. Now, within CMIP 6, there are lots of universities and government agencies creating simulations of what's likely to happen or what possibly could happen to climate change as a consequence of greenhouse gas emissions. And the results are categorized in 4 groups based on, firstly, on what we think, what we assume about future greenhouse gas emissions. And there are 4 pathways that are anticipated. And on the left graph here, I show there the project's assumptions. The first is one possibility is called SP 126, right? And it's a shared socioeconomic pathway, SSP. And then and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 5 there, right? SSP 1, 2, 3, 5. And those are the emission scenarios assumptions. And then there are 2.26, 45, 70, and 85 are appended to those to link those scenarios to the previous IPCC reports. They're called, then they call them RCPs 1.6, RCP 4.5. So the important thing to take away here is that SSP 245, which is the orange line there, is something probably the best we can hope for. And it's roughly what the Paris Accord aimed for. Its emissions would continue to rise until about 2040, stabilize and then drop down by 2100. Then this other one, which I'm going to emphasize, is SSP 5 or 8.85, which is comparable to RCP 8.5, which is, we're going to continue to use CO2 emissions across and allow them to increase as they have been for a while until 2080. And I'm going to show you what that does, right? So the reason that leads to warming is that solar radiation comes to the Earth from the sun, and it arrives at the outer atmosphere at roughly 1,300 watts per meter squared, averaged over the year. And then that warms up the Earth, and the Earth radiates that energy back to space, and it's roughly 1,300 watts per meter squared averaged over the Earth, averaged over the year. And if those two things were slightly different, that is, more energy came in than went out, then the Earth warms. And if more energy goes out than comes in, the Earth cools. And so when we add CO2 to the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, what we do is we reduce the energy that's being radiated to space a little bit. And it if we use this, if we follow this SSP 585 track, by 2100, the difference in the heat emitted from the Earth from what it would have been or what it currently is would be 8.5 watts per meter squared, right? And if we follow the SSP 245, the orange track, then in 2100, the difference in the heat flux of the outer atmosphere would be 4.5 watts per meter squared. That's what the labeling's all about. So 4.5 is, I think, the best we can hope for. 8.5 is like our worst case. Now, given that assumption about how we emit CO2 and other greenhouse gases, we then have to build models of how that carbon is transported around the atmosphere and what it does to the ocean. And those are built into computer systems, and we sort of budget lots of chemicals and momentum and energy in all these little boxes that are schematized on the left. And I show you that because the number of boxes you can have depends upon how big your computer is and how long you're willing to wait. And so roughly, models that are currently available have a grid of about 1 to 200 kilometers. So predicting what happens in Connecticut with those is all limited because Connecticut's not that much bigger than one box. But then there's this invention that occurred over the last 10 years called downscaling, in which there's a sort of a semi-empirical way to try and use statistics from data that we know. We know the temperature varies across Connecticut. Right? We know what that is. And so but we predict the mean value over Connecticut, say. Then we can impose variations that are smaller than that grid scale by using the statistics of data. And that's what this equation is supposed to represent, that if you know a prediction, that's a big X, and then you know how the prediction relates to data, you can try and refine that. And there are 3 different methods of doing that we studied. One by NASA, one which by NRL, by the Department of Energy, DOE, at Oak Ridge Laboratory, another one at the University of Southampton. And those are ways to try and take the projections of these global models and make use of them in Connecticut. And this is the results for Hartford, right? For SSP 245 and SSP 585, this is the maximum temperature at Hartford projected from a bunch of different models between now and the 2100. And you see at 2050, they're up until 2050 or 2060, they don't diverge very much. CO2 emissions don't matter to what happens until late in the century. And it makes a bigger difference after 2100. So we're committed to warming, it seems like. And the difference here in the T-max averaged over the 5-year average T-max is about 2 degrees here, both models. And we could do the same at Wallingsford. And I'm going to show you the daily average. Sorry, this is the daily average wind speed. Connecticut. It doesn't really change very much. You know, it's uncertain, and we don't predict it very well. And we can compare how well these models do to data, and that's what this thing shows on the left. And you know, these are, I don't want to dwell on it, but it shows that some approaches are better than other approaches, and none of them are really great for predicting wind over Connecticut. Finally, I want to mention that the latest work, which is not an IPC project, there's been models that have been created that don't try and do everything, but they do try and resolve tropical cyclones, that's hurricanes. And there are two that were published in 2024, a few months ago, actually. And I'm going to show you the results of those. The citations are here. The red here, this is a map of the world, obviously. And I've got a quote from the paper here. Two different models, ways to predict what's going to happen to to the global climate, which resolve tropical cyclones, predict an increase in tropical cyclone frequency in Connecticut. And that's what this red blotch up here in the Mid-Atlantic shows, right? And it's really worse in the Western Pacific. Yeah. So for insurance companies, I guess they'll be worried about the global distribution. For Connecticut, you know, the best we can say right now is it's likely that tropical cyclone activity will increase in the Northwest Atlantic, and it'll affect us. Finally, I want to just summarize a couple of things. It's not we don't know this. You know, the state has 5 years ago, the last IPCC report was analyzed, and it had similar results. I think the new things are about the increase in tropical cyclones in models. I think that's the biggest impact. Sea level rise projections are not much different. The high winds and high temperatures are not much different. Looking forward, there are new technologies, I think, that are going to allow us to make better predictions about extremes in the future climate scenarios. And maybe 5 years from now, we'll be able to tell you more. But we have made policy changes. We've tried to restrict how building is done in the floodplain, especially along the shoreline. We've allowed towns to raise money in different ways to address climate-related risks. The Green Bank has expanded its programs to include resilience programs to help individuals and businesses. We've done a regional assessment of the municipal vulnerability, and especially with the water treatment plants and drinking water systems. We've done some work on roads resilience. But the thing and there's funding initiatives to help towns do projects that will reduce their risks. But I think the big gap that I've seen in what we've done in the last 10 years is we've not paid enough attention to individual businesses and residences around the state, and to help individuals take action to reduce their risk. And I'm hoping that the programs that evolve from this committee will advance that. Thank you. Sorry about the time.
Thank you so much, Professor O'Donnell. That was really insightful as well. And thank you to Richard earlier. So just a quick time check, since we're halfway through, we're running about 20 minutes late, but what we'll do is we will keep going, but we'll likely take some time away from Q&A and closing remarks to make enough time for the speakers. Okay. So on that note, what we'd like to do is transition to Alexandra Carey, who's remote. She was going to talk about proven affordable standards for strengthening homes against severe weather. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. I'm going to also share my screen, so bear with me. And I am just for everyone's awareness, I'm remote in coastal Alabama, where I have a pretty significant hurricane risk. But what I'm going to talk about today is ways that not just coastal Alabama, but certainly applicable standards for coastal Connecticut as well. I actually grew up in Connecticut, so you're near and dear to my heart, and I would like to make sure you stay that way. Okay, bear with me just a second. having a slow speed right now. I apologize. Come on. All right. You should be seeing the slide. If anybody can give me a yes, that would be great.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so very much. Okay, so I wanted to share just a moment so you understand where Fortified came from, just a brief description of who IBHS is. IBHS is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. We are funded 100% by the property insurance and reinsurance industry to reduce losses and to break the cycle of destruction that a number of the speakers have spoken about today, and that probably some of you out there have experienced. Our whole mission is to keep businesses and homes intact and allow people to recover much more quickly after disasters. We have a research center where we do a significant amount of testing, as well as a lot of research in the field as well. And what we've determined over our years of research, really decades of research, is that wind damage in particular is very predictable. We've seen things out in the fields that we can literally duplicate in the lab. And one of the, what we've really uncovered is that the roof is the most vulnerable part of the home. And most often it is the least inspected when it comes to even when a state or a jurisdiction has good codes, the roof is sometimes left out of that. But it is very vulnerable, first line of defense, the first thing to be damaged. As the wind speeds increase, we start to see these other types of damage. And then when wind speeds max out, we often see a total collapse of the structure. Thankfully, in most cases in Connecticut to date, from a wind perspective, you guys have been have not experienced this total destruction as much, thank goodness. Where all of that research comes to sort of where the rubber meets the road is in our Fortified programs. Fortified addresses some of the more minor vulnerabilities that make a very big difference in home performance. So the Fortified Home Program is what I'm going to cover most today, but we have a Fortified Commercial Program for businesses, and we have a Fortified Multifamily program for any sort of multifamily residential construction. So we really have a program for everyone. We do not address flood. We do have recommendations for flood, and we highly recommend that people are building 3 feet above the base flood elevation in wherever they're building. But we really are focused primarily on wind, which is the losses that the insurance company that fund us are primarily focused on. I'm going to do a quick comparison of traditional code and historical code versus Fortified. Traditionally and historically, code has addressed life safety, so making the building able to survive any sort of severe event. And where Fortified has differed up until now has been that it addresses not just the life safety piece, but also addresses property protection as well, so that a family or a business would have the ability to continue to use that structure either right away or within short order with some minimal repairs. So we're not disaster proofing anything. We are just trying to reduce damage, not necessarily, it is not possible to eliminate all damage. Codes have caught up with that, however, in more recent times, especially in the more recent iterations of the code, and I'm happy to report that Connecticut is included in that. The 2021 IRC includes things that will protect that property as well. So what is Fortified? Fortified is a voluntary standard. We do have a third-party verification piece. It is systems-based versus some component-based that is sometimes included in other mitigation programs. It is geographically appropriate. So regardless of where you are in the country, the program is specific to what your risks are. There are 3 levels of durability, and those build off of one another. So we start at the roof and then it builds up from there. The designations are issued after that third-party validation occurs, and they must be renewed every 5 years. And that is basically just to make sure that everything is still in good condition, no major changes have been made, so that we know the home is going to continue to perform as expected. And then Fortified can be used to improve existing structures as well as new construction. So we have a growing number. You'll hear a little bit later about some mitigation programs that are helping homeowners to replace their roofs and improve their homes' risk. We also have the new construction standard, which tends to be the higher levels of the fortified program. Nationally, we're approaching, actually, we just surpassed 70,000 properties yesterday, in fact, in 31 different states. And so that really runs all sorts of risks across the country that are being addressed by fortified. So we do have different standards. Where the home is located determines what hazard is going to be constructed, or which fortified program is going to be applied. So in coastal areas, which includes most of Connecticut, we have a requirement for hurricane standards. So it would be fortified home hurricane. I think it's only the upper northwest corner of Connecticut that falls under the high wind standard, which covers much of the rest, actually the rest of the country. We do have an optional requirement for hail. So if someone wanted to, they could add the hail requirements, which basically just encompasses adding a hail resistant shingle that we've tested, and then anything on the roof also has to be impact resistant. So the fortified requirements are based on the level that, the applicable weathered hazard. So that would be whether it's hurricane or high wind, based also on local code requirements. So whatever the local code that's been adopted, we are going to refer to that in the standard. So there are wind speed maps that are different based on the code level of adoption. And so we're going to refer to that in the standard. And then the desired level of protection. So fortified roof, and we have a silver level that builds off of roof, and then we have a gold level that builds off of that. To give you a sense of the national picture, we have a lot of concentration in the coastal areas of the Gulf, as well as the sort of the eastern coast there. We do have some homes in Connecticut, in fact, and I'm happy to report. We were talking a little bit earlier. You heard from the Red Cross about how the most vulnerable are usually the ones that are impacted the most, and it happens to be that there are Habitat for Humanity affiliates in Connecticut that have really been leading this in the state and have built the largest number of fortified homes thus far, and that includes New Haven and Hartford. So they're really leading the way, but we're definitely excited to be working with those partners across the country. I wanted to share a little bit about just some experiences that we've had where fortified homes have been impacted by disasters. We had some significant storms that hit North Carolina. A lot of those were actually they were major hurricanes, but they were on the lower end of those. However, they did show some really significant successes. 22% on average had less damage. As far as insurance claims went, we had 35% of those were less likely to have a claim. And when there was a claim, it was on average $3,000 less of that per claim. So that was pretty exciting numbers, showing that fortified really does work. And a lot of this was specifically roof related, which again is where we see the most vulnerabilities. Hurricane Sally was actually one of the more recent ones that we had our largest footprint of fortified homes. I actually live right in the darkest orange color there, where we had the most significant wind speeds. But I want to point out that some of the wind speeds, as you go to the outer bands of these wind speeds, are wind speeds that Connecticut has actually experienced. I lived up there in the 80s when Hurricane Gloria hit, and there were wind speeds up to around 110 miles per hour in that storm. You also experienced tornadoes, as some of you may have experienced directly, or you've heard from earlier that there are varying parts of Connecticut, to include the street I grew up on, that have had tornadoes hit that have caused significant damage. So I wanted to just point that out, that even though this is in the Gulf Coast and this is a hurricane specific to us here, those kinds of winds can impact you as well. So we had 17,000 homes in the path, and 95% had little or no damage or impacts to any sort of fortified related structure components, which was also a very exciting success for us, being that this was such a significant storm event. A lot of the damage that we saw to non-fortified homes was roof related, and that again tracks with our research and what we find in the field regularly. 90% of catastrophic claims include damage to the roof. And when you have roof damage, you have much more damage because water's allowed in, and then you end up with a much bigger claim and oftentimes displacement of the families in those homes because of the water damage. So with fortified, I'm going to do a high level of what we're addressing here. Fortified roof. Basically, it's all about the roof. We are keeping the roof on and we're keeping the water out, which is enhanced by what we call a sealed roof deck, which I'll share a video in just a moment on that. The silver level addresses the roof, and then it also addresses what we call damage amplifiers. So if those systems are damaged, it creates a lot more damage. So particularly in coastal areas, windows and doors and garages are very vulnerable. When they fail, oftentimes that creates much more damage, and to include sometimes catastrophic damage, and when the wind pressures are allowed in the home. The gold level addresses both the roof and the silver level, and then really is designed for new construction primarily, because here we're looking at what we call a load path, which is using hurricane ties to keep the roof on the walls and the walls anchored to the foundation so that the wind pressures really keep, it can't affect that home, and the home is tied into the ground. Again, the hail supplement can be applied to this if someone chooses to do that. I'm going to only dive in on a little bit deeper on the details of fortified roof. Nailing it down with ring shank nails is one of the key pieces here. Ring shank nails versus what is commonly used is a smooth shank nail. So there's little rings down the shaft of that nail, can literally double the strength of that roof deck attachment, keeping your roof deck in place. The next piece is sealing it up. So there are cracks in your roof deck, which are there on purpose for expansion and contraction. Sealing those with tape, which Connecticut has been doing for a number of years now, can prevent water from coming in those cracks. If you lose some shingles or roof cover, it will keep that roof from leaking into the living space or the attic. And then the last piece is using what we call drip eave, that little white strip there, which locks down the underlayment before you put the shingles on. So you essentially have a load path for the roof, keeping everything tied together. And part of the reason for that, you'll see in this video in our lab where you saw that edge fail first. That edge detail that I just mentioned is really important for that. It keeps that edge from coming up, because once that edge leaves, you'll see there, it's quite the domino effect where it starts to take the rest of the roof cover off. The winds here were around 80 to 90 mile per hour winds that were taking that roof cover. This is a duplex structure that we moved in to test. There's one difference between the two sides of the duplex, which you see here, sealed roof deck on one side, not sealed on the other side. Now we have the capacity to dump around 8 inches of rain an hour onto the structures in our lab. And so that's what we're doing here. And you'll see the impact that's having on the side that is not sealed. All the water that is about 65% of the water that's hitting that roof deck is now leaking down into that living space. It's saturating the insulation and the drywall in the attic, and it's leaking down, as you saw, around all the light fixtures. So you can imagine that this is now going to be a home that is not going to be livable once this storm passes. And once we shut the test down, you'll see everything came crashing in. And so this is, some degree of this is typical when we see roof cover loss, we see water come into the home. And again, this is one of the things that you all have been good to prevent for some time now with your sealed roof deck. You'll see the side with the sealed roof deck, little insulation on the ground where we pulled the attic hatch down, but that side is dry. And most importantly, that side would be livable post-storm event. The other side, someone would be displaced for some time. The third party piece is really key. This offers, this is a really good selling point for builders and roofers because they can tell their clients that they have had another verification piece outside of code that has determined that that they've met those standards. All of that documentation that third party person goes out and collects gets sent to us at IBHS, and we issue a designation certificate at the end. And that is what many insurance companies are now going to be looking for, because they know that this has been double checked, that there's been a third party verification, and that it meets program requirements that they have, that they've been funding and that the research supports. So this third party piece is really key. We have online trainings for contractors and roofers, as well as for our fortified evaluator certifications, that fortifiedwise.com. So we try to make it as easy as possible for contractors to get certified. Contractors do not have to be certified this year presently in order to participate in the program. They just have to contact that third-party verification, who we call an evaluator. Soon, at the end of next year, we will be requiring that at least the roofing contractors installing fortified roofs must be certified. We have our standards and all sorts of technical information online, as well as some pretty good homeowner information at fortifiedhome.org if someone was interested in learning more. I wanted to point out that we do have partnerships nationally with a growing number of states. You'll hear from Jeff a little bit later about some of the grant programs that are out there. But we also have Fortified is recognized by all of those top federal agencies that you see there, and you can actually get more money from this from FEMA and through SBA in order to apply Fortified. So you get more funding if you're going to go through that mitigations with Fortified and utilizing those disaster recovery funds. And the last thing I'll mention is that really partnership is key. And I know, since I think that it was the commissioner that mentioned that we can't do this alone. There are some important partners. You already heard from NAIC. Flash is certainly, you'll hear from in just a moment, and they have their playbook, which has been really, really key. And then we have another partner that's not here today, Smart Home America. They actually have CE approvals in many growing number of states for contractors, for insurance agents, for realtors, and they're a very important key partner of ours nationally. With that, I'm going to wrap it up and stop sharing and pass it off to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alex. And just a quick comment, that video is incredibly powerful. Often we hear the words, but when you actually see the video and the impacts, it really leaves a lasting impression. So we're going to transition now back to Jeff to cover climate risk and physical resiliency programs. Please, Jeff.
Yes, thank you again. And hopefully you can see the slides.
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great, thanks. So, and I'll try to tie this back to some of the things I talked about earlier, and hopefully you've seen that thread throughout the other presentations. And I'm glad that Alex just talked about some of the benefits that they're seeing with the program in place. So remember the three pieces of the risk triangle: hazard, exposure, vulnerability. You heard from Jim, right? The hazard, it's changing in Connecticut. There's not a whole lot you can really do about that, right? The exposure, there's some things that you can do about that sort of moving forward in terms of land use policies, et cetera. But with the exposure that you have, you're pretty much set with that. But the third piece of the triangle, the vulnerability aspect, you can do something about. And that's just what Alex, walked through in terms of the Fortified program. So there are things that you can address through vulnerability that will reduce the risk. And as I presented earlier, some of that investment, $13, save per dollar of investment. And then some of these numbers here in terms of Fortified and the pieces that, that Alex just walked through as well, some additional data points. She touched upon too, a number of the programs that already exist. And I'm just going to highlight here, number one, this Alabama Strengthen Homes program, because it's, when you look at the data, they are sort of the clear leader in terms of what's happened or is happening in this space. Not that there aren't other states that are, beginning to play in this game. I think that's really sort of the main message for you all. These programs exist. There are ways to help fund them and to get them built out, and you have resources to help you support the build out of a program in Connecticut if you're going to, follow one. But the important piece here is that these programs involve numerous stakeholders, and Alex kind of highlighted some of those there. And what we're trying to do is really to leverage the existing experience and to build consistency for these programs across the country, leveraging Alabama. I have some outdated numbers. I have 66,000. Alex just mentioned over 70, but Alabama is with 50,000 of these as the clear leader. And the reason I keep harping on Alabama is because at the NEIC, we recently hired Brian Powell, who I'm doing this presentation on behalf of. He's out, I think, working with some states right now on these programs to come in and run sort of our resiliency hub within our Catastrophe Modeling Center of Excellence. So Brian essentially started and ran the Alabama Strengthened Homes program for more than a decade, and then has transitioned over to the NEIC, where he's leveraging his expertise in our partnerships with IBHS and Flash and others, which are just so critical in our resources to help assist states in building out these programs. So I'm just going to kind of walk through some of what, Brian is doing. Unfortunately, he would have a little bit more color on some of this, but if you think about this in terms of sort of three main buckets: program design and implementation. Some of what Brian is doing is, how do you start thinking about this program? How do you importantly develop kind of a legislative strategy around that? And what are some of the pitfalls that you might want to avoid in adopting that? And begin this coordination between the partners, right? Of course, you have to have IBHS and Smart Home and Flash and others involved, right, in sort of the start of this to make sure that you're setting up the program in the right way. And so Brian's role is to engage with the insurance commissioner and the departments to get these programs up and running, in particular, focusing around like a retrofit grant aspect to that. In addition to designing the program from the beginning, there's also sort of ongoing support of the mitigation programs, or just even support in terms of getting your head around how to what these things mean, giving some more context to some of the pieces that Alex was just highlighting. These are peer-to-peer learning opportunities between the different departments of insurance that the NEIC works with, access to resiliency funding. I run a research center, and this sits within a research center. What is the research and analytics that you can do to help support this? And then any notion of innovation. And again, part of the hub is trying to tackle all these different things. And I would just give you some examples of some of this. So Alex just showed you, the lab in South Carolina. We worked with IBHS to do a wildfire burn outside the lab. This was in Boise. I showed you some wildfire data earlier from Boise, but basically we took the IBHS show on the road, and they were able to design sort of a well-built home to wildfire hardening and a non-well-built home, and to display like what the difference is between these two. And we had a whole program designed around this in terms of just other knowledge pieces in this sort of peer-to-peer learning opportunity for our Western Zone states. This is an example of a research report that we did, where we're trying to, again, kind of come back to what is it that you're getting out of implementing these programs. This was, again, focused on wildfire, but it was, what are the benefits saved of a well-built home versus a non-well-built home? And when you run a benefit cost analysis on this, what are you actually getting in different parts of here? This is in California, in different communities. I'm highlighting this to you because this could be really critical. Doing this type of an analysis could be really critical in terms of getting funding. Oftentimes, funding for these programs is needed from a benefit cost perspective, and having the data to be able to do that, to show that, that return can be essential. And there's an ability to do that using catastrophe modeling tools and making sure the IBHS components are demonstrated within that modeling. And the last piece of this, we talked about program design and the ongoing support, and then just different resources. I'll highlight the resiliency playbook and just sort of other pieces that we're trying to build out from a peer-to-peer learning opportunity. Leslie's going to probably get into more detail on this, but we've put together this policy resource guide and playbook that states can follow around building code leadership, retrofit programs, and it's really important creating this culture of resilience. And then with the engagement team, it's nice that you have this playbook that you can kind of review, but then you have resources and partners to actually engage and execute on the playbook. So these things exist for you to take advantage of. And that last bullet is really important too, because really what you're trying to do, I mean, the numbers might not seem that staggering, right? 70,000 total across the country. I think there's what, 80 some million homes. You're never going to, hit the 80 million homes, that single family units that, need to be retrofitted, but you can start to build this culture of resilience with the programs driving that. So then it starts to embed in other aspects of, of the state. And I think these programs really are kind of the tip of the spear in doing that and building out this culture of resilience, which is what they did in Alabama. So the last things I'm going to end with here are just, I showed you at the beginning the states that have existing programs in place and retrofit grants, programs associated with that. This picture just gives you a sense of, beyond the states that have programs, who else is interested in starting up one? Connecticut's highlighted there. I know Brian is engaged with the group on this. But what you're seeing is a lot of interest in these programs being established. Well, why is that? Because they're critical, right? With all the issues that property markets are dealing with, right? Reducing that vulnerability, reducing that risk is something that is very tangible and can make a big difference. And the last thing I'll leave you with here is again, like, you have resources at your disposal through the NEIC and through this community of practice and partners that we're working with on how to get these programs up and running and sustained and then enhanced over time. So across the top, it's not just, hey, like, let's start a program. But, with Alabama's, they've been in existence for now, 15 some years. They've had to change. They've had to modify. They've had to enhance, right? They've actually are starting to try to get more fortified homes in their inland areas, right? As opposed to just in their coastal counties. So this isn't just sort of a one-shot thing where you stand up a program and then that's it. Like, this is an ongoing endeavor. And I just highlight again, you have support to help you sort of through all pieces, of all phases of that effort over time.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that second presentation. We know that you're doing it on behalf of Brian Powell, who couldn't join us, but really important information in there. And you really pulled the threads together across these. So we do have our final speaker today, which is Leslie Chapman Henderson. She's president CEO of Flash, which was referenced in that. So Leslie, if you wouldn't mind, please take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And my colleague Lorelei is going to help me move through these slides. Lorelei, you can go ahead and go to the next one. For those of you that may not know us, we are a 26-year-old 501c3 nonprofit formed specifically with the mission to strengthen homes and safeguard families. We started out with just hurricanes, and of course now we strengthen homes from disasters of all kinds. Our mission, if you've heard taking science to the street, we take building science to Main Street. Our job is to work with our academic, engineering, and other research partners to bring programs together that help socialize and make understandable the things that make your home stronger in the face of disaster. We do this with policy, with social marketing, and many other things. So just go ahead and talk about the playbook on the next slide. As Jeff mentioned, we're very proud of our partnership with NEIC and Jeff when he came to the center to CIPR. And what we talked about is, how can we put together resources that create a welcome mat for leaders from all different sectors, public, private, and nonprofit. And this particular effort is focused on insurance commissioners, and that's where we started. The idea that your insurance commissioner, Commissioner Mace, is the de facto risk manager for your state. So there's no more fitting role for him and for others, and through the creation of groups like yours, than to take a look at the different things that can be brought to bear to lift up Connecticut and make it more resilient. And so we did a behavior-focused study with NAIC members in their departments to do this. And all of our work is informed by either lengthy qualitative, quantitative behavior-focused studies and coupled with periodic surveys. So we're always talking to people, you know, what are you hearing? What do you need? How do you want to hear it? Who do you want to hear it from? And different ways to create our initiatives. But in this effort in particular, what we noticed is a trend. There's no one single plank or path or focus area that leads to widespread resilience that takes off under its own power, right? It's an integrated, comprehensive set of things. And that's what we designed into the playbook. And that's what our goal was to provide to the commissioners and by extension, all of you. So what are those three things? And here they are again. I think Jeff just showed a similar slide. If you go to the next, Lorelei, it's basically three things when it comes to a home standing up to disaster. It's building codes, right? What I like to say is build it right the first time. The second piece is programs that we're seeing in the great progress we're making and seeing the uptake of mitigation grant programs where you address older pre-code homes, right? I call that fixing up the old stuff, right? We've got to do that too. But the third part, which is essential, is this culture of resilience where all the effort, policy programs, grants, whatever we're doing right, actively and proactively, is giving lift to a marketplace where people want this, they understand it, and they buy it because of it, right? Homes in Oklahoma that have a tornado safe room are more valuable and are desired. Homes in the Alabama coast with fortified roof are in the MLS and are more desired. And that's when you get the lasting change you're looking for that protects your state and stabilizes your insurance marketplace. So let's talk about the building code piece first. You can go past this one, Lorelei, thanks. And this was a 2-year comprehensive behavior focused study when we talked to consumers about codes. And we did this in the first years as a desire to work. It was funded by DHS and FEMA. A lot of our work is funded by FEMA Building Science because, again, they want us to take that science to Main Street. And we know that we have a big problem with building codes in terms of popular attitude because the public thinks they already have them. They're convinced everything's good. You build my car a certain way to keep me safe. I'm sure my house is good too. But as we know, that's not necessarily the case. Now, you guys are doing a great job in Connecticut and keeping up with the modern codes. You have the newest and latest. It's a matter of continually updating as well as preserving what you have. And George has been a leader in that as well. But not everybody's home was built this year. So we have to look at where you start and what code you have and where you can go. So we developed a tool on the next slide, you'll see, inspecttoprotect.org. This is a very unique free tool, transparent down to jurisdictional levels that helps people understand what is my building code and what does that mean to me. And we've done, I think that the program is about 5 years old at this point. We've done continuous enhancements to it and added features based on survey and research inputs from homeowners and users. We have a massive upgrade coming to this in January. I can't wait to come back and show you the new Strong Home Scale that will be a part of this. But I wanted to show you some things about Connecticut and the way that these lookups, one of the reasons we're all working so closely together is these insights provide the starting point for your Connecticut homeowners who are thinking about retrofits, whether they're getting them funded through a matching grant or they're getting them and just taking off on their own and doing the few things that they learn about. So you can put your address in. We've got Hartford in here. And it's going to give you a basic indication. This is a very simple interface, which is exactly what people want. Red, yellow, green, black means no data, okay? And it's going to give them a basic indication of where they're starting. If you look on the next slide, we're also going to give them a little history. We use the FEMA disaster data set, the declared disasters. You can get the county level, the statewide, and then the code history for your state. So if your home isn't built in 2024, if you see the next slide, you can drop down into the range of codes and it's a little small, sorry about that, 05 to 2015, we're going to give you a correlated set of recommendations based on what we know was in or not yet in the code for the year your home was built. And this is very empowering information. And when it comes to resilience and getting people to lean in and act and participate, it is all about empowerment. If you go to the next slide, I went to Bridgeport, which I flew over after Superstorm Sandy as part of the Hurricane Center team. And remember seeing from the air what had happened with your largest city. This is a much older home, right? 1928, but we still have some recommendations if you look on the next slide, even for that beautiful little bungalow. On some of the things, this is on the first one I showed you, those are recommendations for wind, and they are segmented by peril. This one is for floods. Okay, so this is the kind of information and data that powers the hub. And the idea of the hub came out of the study we did as we wrote the playbook and resource guide and gave you guys this collection of all the economic studies, the toolkits for building codes, how to adopt a code, how to keep a code current, and then how to figure out what your starting point is. So that's a pretty fast pass through building code leadership. But again, you guys are doing a great job. Just want you to understand that there are ways to figure out where you're starting if your home wasn't built currently. So let's skip past the second piece of the formula, which Jeff covered, which is the mitigation retrofitting grant programs, which come to bear for helping people move the needle as he described. And let's talk about the culture of resilience, because this is the biggest umbrella, right? Lorelai, if you want to go ahead and go just to, oh, I just skipped one. Sorry about that. This one I put in here, I just wanted you to see this because this is informing to the next iteration of Inspector Protect. This is our challenge. When you stack all the things people want in a home up together, sturdiness of construction comes out on top. When you ask them what their top 3 things are, it comes out in the top 3 each time, where you see on the right, 63 is still appearance. But look at the bottom. People do not understand the connection between building codes and sturdiness of construction, right? So this is what our next iteration of Inspector Protect is going to address. And Lorelai, if you could just jump to the next one. That's just the coming attraction in 2025, this strong home scale of calibrated information and then giving people more of what they want. I'll be delighted to come back and share the details of that with you because it's going to be very exciting. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the culture of resilience. Okay, so on this next slide again, this is the third piece, and this is the really custom aspect to all of this because one, your starting point in Connecticut is different from other places, but two, sometimes we just don't know which aspect to our resilience advocacy is really going to take hold. We do know, though, from, again, going back to Alabama, that programs like mitigation grants and the upgrades they did to their building code along the coastline in the days ahead of that program getting established, those are what kickstart the marketplace that takes off. 70,000 fortified roofs in a place where they haven't, I don't think, crested 7,000 grants. So these things all become an impetus to lasting resilience over time, both across public as well as private sector and individual behavior. So how do we create a culture of resilience? Let's go to the next slide. So you've heard everything I ever learned was in kindergarten. I will tell you that as an organization, almost everything we've ever learned about how to help consumers really get excited about resilience, we learned at Disney World. We spent 8 years in Epcot with a landmark exhibit there called Stormstruck, Tale of Two Homes. In fact, we hosted NAIC and many other groups there while we were there for 8 years. Carnegie Mellon did a study for us about what worked and what didn't in a 1-year follow-on study with control groups. It's about empowerment, okay? One would think that logic and facts, and I used to teach overseas, and logic and facts are great and they work in the classroom. But when you're trying to get people to differentiate and value an activity like, choosing a home with a stronger roof or being willing to pay a little bit more to upgrade something you already have, you have to put them in charge. So that is the cornerstone of the formula that we use for any type of public awareness and different program. I was going to speak in particular about one that we've worked on this past year that's been very successful with NIST. So if you go to the next one, this is just a small example of how you can really move action in the market. So NIST did a correlation analysis of the Joplin tornado homes, 3,000 of which retain their garage doors. Now, we've always known garage door performance, as Alex mentioned too, is really critical to keeping the wind out of a structure. And we've always known it was one of the first things we saw when we saw damage where the roof was damaged from the inside out, right? Because that garage door is the largest and weakest opening. So NIST, through our partnership, broke off a piece of a study that's not even published yet and gave us this correlation analysis of the 3,000 homes, because in every instance where the garage door was intact, the roof and adjacent walls were intact as well. We took the information and made it the cornerstone of our Hurricane Strong campaign with the Hurricane Center this year and our Tornado Strong program with other partners. And because of that, we got, and if you go to the next slide, and Lorelei, you'll have to tap through these as you know, we got headlines in national and local, digital and other different broadcast settings. And we got meteorologists around the country talking about how important your garage door is. And this is a pretty mundane topic, garage doors, but it's also a really powerful aspect to how you can keep your home intact in a high wind event, whether it's a tornado, severe convective storm, hurricane, or anything else. So this is kind of an example of how you can take the research and the compelling data like that of IBHS or NIST or Florida College of Engineering and others to really get people moving. And often they will get moving on their own long before you have a chance to be there. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit more about just the impact it's simple, relevant, empowering messaging campaigns can have. And this is kind of the formula that we use, and we would be delighted to help you figure out the lineup for Connecticut and craft these plans as you put them together. So last thing I wanted to do is show you, we have, and I took out all the slides. I know we're up against some time here, but I wanted to just mention we have a very deep well of resources and programs that can be brought to bear. We created this one for FEMA, Ready Business, all different hazards. This is for businesses and organizations and other things. And we'll be happy to bring all of those, they're open source and available to be used to customize for Connecticut. And the last thing I wanted to do is give you a sneak peek to something else that's new. I was really glad to see Jeff talking about wildfire, because I know in the lineup you've had the one event, but we do have a new Strong coming out this year. We have a very successful Hurricane Strong, Tornado Strong, and Earthquake Strong program. What we haven't had before is Wildfire Strong, and that's coming this year. So I'm going to close my presentation with, you'll be the first ones to see this, our new Wildfire Strong animation. But before I do that, I want to just explain, again, using our research, we figured out what people don't understand, which is the fire triangle, and they further don't understand the removal of fuel and how important that is. So let's go ahead, Lorelei. Thank you so much for helping me do this, and play the animation, and that's it for me after that.
Oxygen, heat, and fuel. All three are necessary for a fire, but by removing the fuel, wildfires cannot form and burn. So to prevent their spread and damage to your home, it's important to create a 0 to 5 feet fuel-free zone, removing combustibles like debris, furniture, or vegetation. Even if you think you're out of range, embers can still travel up to 3 miles. So if you move it, block it, and maintain it, an ember can't ignite it. No fuel, no fire. Visit nofuelnofire.org to learn more.
So we'll be launching that this coming year, early in the year, and we will have the pre and post surveys to show the take-up and the understanding, and if we've moved the message and the levels that go with it. This is just, again, an example of the different elements that, through our partnership with NEIC, are in the hub and part of the package that we could put together for you so that people are in charge of their own disaster resilience destiny, because that's what it takes to affect lasting change. So thank you very much. And I think that's it for me.
Leslie, thank you so much for that phenomenal presentation. We have a few minutes for questions from our advisory council members, so I'd like it to open it up for a few questions. Advisory council members? Go ahead, Johanna.
I think this might be a question for Jeff, but any of our panelists could take it if they feel so moved. I was wondering what the difference between catastrophe modeling is and then what we've traditionally used in hazard mitigation plans, which is the FEMA HAZAS program that usually gives us the amount of debris that's generated or the number of homes that are impacted. So what might be a data discrepancy in how we're defining our risk exposure?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, we've tried to address this. Essentially, there's overlap between the two, but they're sort of used for different purposes. And the catastrophe modeling is used by the insurance industry. That's what they use to underwrite risk. The tool HAZAS is sort of it's a form of a CAT model. It's not a CAT model that an insurance company would utilize. So it does help to inform risk in that way for certain perils. But that tool is used for state hazard mitigation plans for different purposes. But I think one of our goals is to embed the use of CAT models within the state hazard mitigation planning. Again, because the risk assessment experts, who are the insurance and reinsurance industry, those are the tools that they are using, right? So that's not to say that the state hazard mitigation plans are not assessing risk properly. There could be some room for enhancement there.
Brian?
First of all, just want to commend all the presenters for just an exceptional job kind of getting us teed up for what we're going to be working hard on over the course of the next couple of months. I was really taken by Jeff and Richard's presentations. The math of the insured losses, the property losses, the protection gap, kind of the quantifiable stuff, but also the hard to quantify stuff. I think, Richard, you really drove home that point of the things that aren't on the list that really can fundamentally change the life of families, especially vulnerable communities. So what's in my mind is one, how can we think about research to try to get at the quantification of those costs that may be seemingly unquantifiable, and how to think about the most vulnerable in that context? Because when you see the numbers, you kind of automatically, we all just go at the numbers to try to make them better. But how do we think about the metrics for the most vulnerable?
So I'm happy to start on that. I mean, there is existing literature around that and metrics that do exist and studies that have been done that show that. It's just they're not as sorry to use jargon, but that literature is not as deep, it's not as rich as it is on the property side. So there are starting points that can be leveraged. And in fact, even I think the mitigation saves numbers that I had shown, they try to estimate some of that. So we can provide you with some of that information to help guide, trying to incorporate that, because those indirect effects are really not well understood. And in my opinion, if they are, would make a big difference in terms of moving things forward and helping to further bolster like the need to be doing this type of work.
So I had a question I think for Leslie, a technical question on building code. So you mentioned that Connecticut has done a good job. I think you referenced a 2021 building code in place in Connecticut. Trying to draw a connection between those latest and greatest building codes and then the fortified standards that Alex talked about. So to what extent do those top building codes lend themselves to the fortified standards, the nails, the flashing, those types of things?
Well, because IBHS participates in the building code development process, they're getting closer and closer. And the way that works is they participate mainly through the International Code Council model code development process to get the insights on sealed roof deck are a perfect example. I'm sure Alex would agree. The sealed roof deck research and engineering was so compelling that it was put into the model building code to be adopted out by the different states. And so it's a very slow, unfortunately, it's a very slow process, but those elements are making their way into the model codes. But that doesn't mean that you have to wait for the model. Connecticut and Georgia's been very engaged on building codes, especially on the sealed roof deck issue. You can go beyond the code of the model code and customize your own Connecticut code. Florida routinely does that and other places. And I think the closer you get to the fortified practices, the better off you are. And the piece that gets them into the model is the science and engineering, but it is very slow. So that's actually something in an analysis that we can create too. And I think that work is underway already to look at what kinds of things can be taken out and sped to market in your version of the code. You're getting ready to go through an update process, or you're midway right now. I think it's starting. So that's a perfect question and probably a prime zone for improvement.
Thank you.
And if I could just add one thing on that too, remember with building codes, while Leslie and I think like to say these are the cornerstone of resilience, that is for properties moving forward. The fortified standards in some ways, can be above code, but they're also for properties that exist today, right? And retrofitting them. So codes aren't going to fix the properties that you have in place, but the retrofitting can. So it's an important distinction. And you really, to have a resilient community moving forward, you need both of those pieces. You can't just have one.
Thank you. Any additional questions as we close out? Let me say thank you to all of those speakers who took the time to join us today. We appreciate the information that you have provided us. It has been a real education, I know, for me, and I think for many of my advisory council members. So a heartfelt thank you from all of us around the table in the room today. We are not opening ourselves up to any public comments today. We will have additional meetings where we will be open to public discussion and comments at this time. Again, thank you to all our advisory council members. Thank you to the members who joined us today from the media. And again, thank you to all of us who are taking the time to participate in this wonderful opportunity to help educate our residents of Connecticut, and especially to our wonderful insurance commissioner, Commissioner Mays, for bringing us all together in this wonderful effort. And my co-chair, would you like to close out?
Just to say again, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Commissioner Mays. Thank you to the team here of the advisors, and thank you for the public for listening. I really encourage everyone to play this back one more time because there's so much information. Even I learned a couple things new, and I'll have to replay it myself. So again, thank you.
One special thank you to the staff of the Connecticut Department of Insurance for all the work you did to make this happen, and your support for this advisory council and the efforts you've put in. Thank you all. We appreciate you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.